And cue. I just, when Nkanyezi was sharing your many accolades, Joanne, some of those stories, I was in the field with Joanne covering. And our relationship is more than that of colleagues. We've been friends, really true friends, I would say, for many, many years. You're someone I'm incredibly proud of. And in these days where life is so unguaranteed, Neil, I want to say this in the presence of all your friends and a lot of people joining online, just how much I respect you as a human being. And how much I respect you as a colleague. Your mind is insightful, and I've got the shivers going into conversation with the Joanne Joseph. I mean, come on. So go easy on me tonight. Any flaws are all mine and none yours. So I want to start off by saying, and pardon the glasses, Clive Simpkin, if you tweet that I am wearing glasses because I'm getting old, there's going to be a problem. But okay. So I want to start by saying Vanakkam, Majum, Vadavekiram, which is the Tamilian version of hello and welcome, but in Telugu, my ancestral language, Mariyu Svargatam. My grandmother spoke Telugu when we were growing up. I didn't understand a lot of it. Nengapoda maybe was about the extent of it. Those of you who are Telugu speaking will understand. But in reading this book of yours, it took me to so many different places, which you don't expect to stop on when you're reading a novel that is not about your life. And so it was really beautiful being a part of this process. So it feels very good to be all in the same place at the same time with actual human beings. To be able to see people and not avatars, and not have to say, the mic is off, unmute. I'm sure that we might have, well, we're not going to have anyone on live, but we are being joined by people who are streaming this broadcast, so to speak, from many different places, our online friends, well-wishers, supporters, and the generally curious. So welcome to each one of you. I just want to take a moment, though, if I can, to acknowledge all the people who could not be in this room tonight, due to illness or due to sorrow, not only because of this awful pandemic, but also beyond, centuries beyond, to those whose bodies and stories are still lying asleep under the Indian Ocean. Their memories, in some way, Joanne, become animated on a night like this because while this story that we're sharing tonight is fictionalized, it's a weaving together of experiences, and it is telling our own stories about our great-great-grandparents who undertook the journey, who uprooted themselves from their ancestral lands. They were at the mercy of traffickers, sometimes their own people, their own kinsmen. They were abused, they were broken, they were traumatized, before they ever reached the land of the green and sweet hills that covered the red-hearted sands of Port Natal. And for me, it was especially poignant reading the story with its lilting descriptions of the towns that people come from, like Bakaruti. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Correctly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the town of our chief protagonists, and the hope that was hinted at for what they would encounter here in the great Port Natal. And there were visceral renditions, as you'll see in the book, of life before and after the boarding of the ship. The detail of suffering and the suicide. What does it mean to have family? What does it mean to have kin? What does it mean to be in a particular class? And all of this really brought home the stark details of my own grandparents and their parents and what they endured on that arduous journey to the not-so-promised land that was supposed to be about fair work, fair pay, just conditions, and the possibility of a life that was different from forced marriage, poverty, and an insidious caste system. As I'm talking, I see a couple of nods in the audience, and I'm going to guess that a number of you can relate to the story, besides Joanne and myself, that you had ancestors who came, from foreign lands. You just want to quickly raise your hands. Should I have guessed? And I really hope that during the Q&A portion, you share some of those stories. Joanne, okay, I'll get there, because I'm getting carried away now, but I'll get there. There's something I want to say. But we all have albums that are silent. And it's only when you read stories like this do you realize I should go back to those albums. I should go back to the people who still live, that chain of oral tradition, to tell me the truth and tell me the story of me and where I come from. So that is this delicious adventure we're about to embark on this evening. Just to let you know, my ancestors came from Anikapalam in Visakhapatnam, And actually, it is 800 kilometers along the same coast that the characters in this book walk to get to Madras, which is latter-day Chennai. And look, the ancestors in this story, or the characters in this story came on the James Owen. But of course, my family, in true Puntins Hill style, had to come on the SS Munro XL because we had to be extra large. So, we like to do things in a big way. All right, so jokes aside, Joanne, I want to appreciate you for what you have tried to accomplish in tying us so closely to Shanti and through her stories and experiences, because we get to imagine what that storied adventure might have been for our own ancestors. So I want to begin with the sharing of Children of Sugarcane, with the award-winning question that all journalists have to ask. What made you write the story? But I won't.
I've never been asked that before.
But I won't, because I have actually read your book. So I want you to take our audience to the spark, right, which is really that picture of Auntie Atilakshmi. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yes. That is your great-great-grandmother, and the 9-year journey that was born out of that encounter.
So thank you, Iman, for that beautiful introduction. I couldn't have hoped for more, honestly. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for being here to share this moment with us today. And essentially, the story did start 9 years ago with my digging into the ancestry on my maternal side. So on my father's side of the family, we have passenger Indians who paid their way and came over, and we have an idea, it's relatively well documented. And my cousin Enid, who's sitting in the audience, is among those who spent a lot of time looking at all of that history and getting it down. Not so on my mother's side. On my mother's side, there's been a huge amount of mystery surrounding the family, surrounding the background to how they came to be in South Africa. And we really have these two figures who start to appear when you start excavating that history. The one is this amazing young woman, Adilakshmi Velunaikan, who came from a village called Salem in Chennai, what is now Chennai, what was then the Madras Presidency. And she came with two younger siblings. She simply got on a boat. It would have been very unusual at that time for her to travel on her own, without any kind of chaperone, so to speak. The idea that a young woman would willingly leave her home without a chaperone, without any kind of older family member, especially a male family member, traveling with her, take this arduous journey with her younger siblings to a continent that was entirely foreign to them, where not even their mother tongue would have been widely spoken. It struck me as being quite astonishing. Why would she have done it in the first place? And of course, I began to dig around in the archives to see what the possible reason could have been. And of course, there aren't any clear reasons in regard to her life specifically. But history has left a number of interesting trails and vestiges that give you an idea of what might have prompted her to do so. And you get a sense, first of all, of the destabilization of India from a socioeconomic point of view, from a cultural point of view, even with the presence of the British there. And how subsistence farming would have simply fallen away with the British having introduced their own commercial enterprises and forced people to take those up. You get a sense of how, the oppression of the British in that territory would have weighed so heavily on people in so many ways. There would have been droughts and famines in that area at around the same time. And you would have been left with a decimated population. You would have had young people saying, I can't possibly live here anymore. It's a matter of life or death for me. And so in the instances where people had choices, I imagined my great-grandmother potentially getting onto a ship and sailing these dangerous seas that were known as either the Mad Ocean or the Black Waters to come to Port Natal in the hope that there was a better life for her and her siblings on this side.
When we look at that history, and you've told it so well, as to where those points of invocation lie in filling in the gaps in your great-grandmother's story, there's a sense of romance that I know I personally had when I considered the story. I mean, we heard about the tough conditions and so on, but the overriding theme was about this hopefulness in a new promised land, and we kind of think it's similar to the opportunities we have today. It is unlike any of that. And this book, in filling in those gaps and in telling it through this way, allows us to see more viscerally just the detail of subjugation, about the loss of agency, dependency, which is everything that you were running away from. Because in Shanti's story, that was such a big feature. She didn't want to be in a context where her future was going to be decided for her. But there we're going to get back to that. So in this discussion, we're not going to, hopefully not going to do the usual things, which is kind of, tell you everything, because we want to leave it to be delicious enough that you go and you try to fill in some of the blanks on your own. So as we get to the later sections, you'll see that we kind of move forward and come full circle to the beginning and the opening chapters of the book. So let's look at the opening. And by the way, I mean, Joanne, I love writing, as you know, and I love reading. And there are not a lot of books that really grip me. And I'm no gold standard for anyone's reading choices or behavior. But it did grip me in the same that it did you, to stay from start to finish. You write so beautifully. You also write with such a clarity and an unclutteredness. And so it was so elegant for me to page through each page and want to know how the story was going to develop. So the scene is set in the very beginning of the book for the painful separations and some of these mysterious reunions to come. And we come to know this. Ooh, am I flashing people? Poor things. Have I? Okay.
We're hoping to get a larger audience on the live stream.
Well, then it's not going to happen, sadly. All right. So there is this garrison town, Bakuruti, where everyone is. And there are a lot of shifts that are manifest through the way that Shanti's own personal story develops. You notice or you see certain things that kind of bring the caste system to light, the patriarchy to light, in the way that her parents' marriage, Manikam and Meena, interact, and some of the sacrifices and choices that are made along the way. But we become very familiar with what life would have been like for the lower castes during this time. And I would love for you to share with our audience how Shanti's position and her aspirations were an important device to reveal the caste differences at that time and its implications. I mean, we can go into the story of Auntie Saras, who was a Brahmin woman married to a Brahmin or a priest who were on the upper echelons of the caste system, really liking this girl and taking her under the wing and doing the unforgivable, trying to teach her how to read and write.
Yeah, and that only happens because she has the realization that she, as an older woman, Auntie Saras this is, has lived under the grip of the caste system herself for so long and has never questioned it. And that this is her one chance to actually change the trajectory that the caste system puts you on as someone born into it. It's a very, very difficult thing to write about, Iman, because there isn't a direct equivalent in our society. We may talk about classism, for example. We touch on racism. Our understanding is very intersectional, but we don't understand caste in the same way because it doesn't really exist in many other places in the world in the way it does in India. Of course, it's been transported to this country in certain ways. But it's a social system, essentially, that is linked to religion, that is so intrinsically linked to culture, that is so deeply linked to even the bodily functions of people, that are, or the bodily functions of animals. How closely do you deal with the bodily functions of animals? If you, for example, work with leather, or if you work with liquids, the bodily fluids of any animals, you will naturally fall onto a lower caste. And so it's a system that has been so deeply entrenched over so many centuries in India that it is simply second nature to the people who are part of that society. And there is no questioning it until, of course, we see the start of that unraveling. And the first inkling we have of that is the relationship between Auntie Saras and Shanti, in which some of those caste differences are called into question for the first time. And of course, in a far more dramatic way, we see it happening once they're on the ship and everyone is thrown together. And it's interesting because, of course, the British, we know, would have homogenized Indians and imagined that everyone is the same. All in a day's work. But that's actually not true. I mean, we now know I mean, it's similar to our country. We have so many cultures, so many languages, so many differences between people who are all grouped under the same racial umbrella that we know better now than to believe that everybody is similar. And once those bonds start to unravel, there's a kind of social revolution that takes place on the boats and that continues to play out in Port Natal. So caste is something that people in that society are very, very bound by until they find a way out of it, because it's deeply oppressive in a way, if you are not sitting at the top of that hierarchical pyramid.
You know, I promised we were going to have a conversation, so you're forcing me to just scoot all over these little screen grabs I've taken of questions I want to ask, because the theme around caste is a very important and key device throughout the book. You see its rise in the first chapters, you see its palpability in the influence that it has in the lives of people every single day. Her father, her mother, the shopkeeper's assistant, Cyrus, the healers, all of that. You see everyone lumped together on a ship where the Brahmin caste is still thinking they have some leverage and some opportunity to be superior over the Dalits or those who are untouchable, essentially. And yet they have to come to this realization that on that place, on the James Owen, there is none of that. And I wondered, Joe, and I wondered throughout the book actually, if that was the reason people like Rathilal, who turns out to be one of the overseers on the James Owen, and others like him, the overseers on the plantations themselves, began to almost match the brutality of the British in the way that they could dehumanize their own kin. I mean, and sometimes these were people from their own villages. These were, sometimes they knew the family members of the other people that were there, and yet it's almost like they went blow for blow with the British.
And aren't there people in all cultures who do that? It's that grab at power when you know that you are a disempowered person in society and you suddenly see a way of elevating yourself above the rest of your kin who are oppressed. And Rangasamy and many of the overseers do exactly that. They collude with the British. They are implicated in the colonial system, and they help carry out the work of the British. They do their bidding. And they engage in the dehumanization of their own people with little or no guilt at all. And I think we see this, we continue to see this in modern day, globally actually, but also in Africa. We've seen many leaders oppress their own people. We've seen many leaders, delight in the luxuries of their own lives while the people suffer. That is a very familiar sight to us. And that tends to be a sort of power play that is made in several different places in the world in these positions, where this is a deeply dehumanizing system. Either I will become one of the oppressed, or I will collude with the oppressors to ensure my own survival. And it really isn't that uncommon. It's very sad indeed, and and in a way it's angering even. But I believe that might be the motivation for it. Either be swallowed by the system or collude with the system and survive.
They did seem to take a particular delight, though, in the oppression, the subjugation, and in being the arms, the eyes, the feet, the sjambok of the oppressor. And we'll get back there because it's a theme that recurs both on the James Owen and then on some of the plantations. But let's go back before this arduous journey from Vakaruti to Madras. And so here is Shanti. She's in this home. Her sisters are married off. She encounters one of her sisters who had gone off to get married, having a really, really rough time, and eventually meeting her fate at the end of her sari, having hanged herself because she was the subject of just so much abuse. Again, a common theme which we encounter several times in the book. And you have Shanti looking at all of this, also being assisted by a letter that Auntie Cyrus, the teacher, had left for her once she had passed away, really sort of encouraging her to embrace and to pursue her own independence and freedom. And so when there's this talk of Muthan, this railroad worker, being promised to her and the likelihood of her being married to him, there's so much convergence that happens, and you'll see this happen with the character of Shanti throughout the book. The realizations and convergences and wisdoms that descend upon her that really bring out her desire to survive and to transcend, whether it is her geography, whether it is her history, whether it is her family expectation. And so she devises a plan because she ends up at Mr. Ramdeen's shop. Now, I love the description of him, and when you read Jo's book, everything is really a picture in your mind. It really is such a conjuring, and I really love that about your writing. So Ramdeen is there, he's this man with this bulbous nose, and he sells spices, but like all of our families, Indian families that is, there's always a business on the side. And he is actively harvesting, well, not harvesting, but soliciting people to go on this journey and come to South Africa and be a sugarcane laborer. So she encounters him, and Bilal, basically his shop assistant, says, do you know what he's really doing? And she gets the first wind that there could be a possibility of escape for her. And for me, it was so, I'm imagining all of this because, and just a quick one, sorry, Jo, this is your book launch, but I want to just say something really quickly. Do you know what happens when you watch a movie about a book? The movie tells you the image, and so it is very set and contained. It is there. But when you are reading, the conjuring is entirely different. So I have imagined all of this. I hope it matches your imagination because I've added so many dimensions. But anyway, so there is, and it's important because she has these epiphanic moments at several points in her journey, even when things are really, really tough. So tell us, pick up the story from when she sees Tirna, her childhood friend, come to say goodbye in the middle of the night, the possibility of a new life, the urgency of the impending marriage to the railway worker Muthan, all of this conspiring together to lasso her in a completely different direction.
Well, that's the turning point, isn't it? I mean, here you've got a 14-year-old, and for a moment, let's just look at it with our 21st century sensibilities. Shanti is younger than my daughter when she is being forced to marry a man much older than her. And the thought of that as a 21st century reader, writer, someone doing the research really galls me, right? Because we understand right now that there's no way that could possibly be right for a child. But she has that realization because she's had access to some measure of education. And she looks around her, and that's what it is. It's the education that peels away the blindness from her eyes. She suddenly sees that the world could be so much more if she had access to an education. I'm going to tell you a little story that I've been told. I was told this by a very elderly aunt of mine who passed away over a year ago, perhaps a couple of years ago. And she told me about my great-grandmother on my father's side of the family. This was the educated side of the family, right? That was a bit more privileged. Apparently, when she turned 16, she was to be married. And on the day of her marriage, her parents couldn't find her, and she'd been climbing a tree. So they called her down from there, and they said, come down. Her name was Mary Ann Bickham. Come down. And I don't think she was very keen on doing that, to attend her wedding. So she lingered up there for a bit, and she had to be given a hiding to get down and get into her wedding dress and get married. What does that say about a society that expects that of children? As a 16-year-old, she knew that wasn't right for her. And Shanti is 14 when she has to make this choice. She has seen the violence of rape within marriage in her friend's life. She has seen the potential for her own future and her own education. Why on earth would she want to stay in a place where she knows she would simply be a caged bird? And that's really what forces her to do what she does, to turn her back on her parents and the only life she knows. Coming from the sheltered life that she does, it is such a difficult choice for her, but it is the only choice for her if she wants to live a life outside of the one that's been carved for her and has been carved for generations of women before her. And it's really that courage and that desire to get away from it that gives her the impetus to get onto the ship. And Iman, it was very intentional that she did not leave specifically because of the famine or the droughts. She did not leave specifically because of the poverty. She did not leave specifically because of the politics of the time. because she's not entirely aware of all of that as a 14-year-old. But she flees her own society. She flees the culture sewn into the fabric of her society that disadvantages her. She flees the patriarchy in her society that dictates what her life path should be. And it's important to point that out, that there were not only people fleeing the larger sort of macro issues of the time, there were people fleeing the micro issues that haunted them in their homes, on the mats where they slept at night. And South Africa, for many of those women in particular, became a haven, so to speak. There were women who were divorced, well, not divorced, but who were trying to escape from their husbands or from the cruelty of their husbands' families. There were women whose entire identities had been expunged from the records when their husbands died. There was nothing left for them in India. And Shanti is, in a manner of speaking, one of those young women who leaves for precisely that reason.
We encounter a character much later on when they land in Port Natal. If my memory serves me, because I'll have to flip through to see it, it's Mariama. And it is her 2 children that she comes to Port Natal with. And I mean, think about it. They are 7 and 3 years old. And you're in a strange land. They are separated from their mother because the British overseers declare them fit for work. The one goes into apprenticeship and the other one goes to work on one of the estates. This desire to cling to family, to make a better life, and then to have your hopes dashed. I mean, that again is a story of betrayal that is repeated constantly throughout the story. And that for me was very, that point was, I mean, it was poignant because it was a reminder of, again, that the brutality of that time.
And it reminds you a little bit of slavery, doesn't it? I always make the distinction between particularly the transatlantic slave trade and indenture, because they weren't exactly the same thing, but indenture in many ways encompassed the spirit of slavery. So you can imagine, and we've seen that, and we've read about it, and we've watched it on television or film. We've watched families being separated. We've watched an entire family arrive there in the hope that they would be kept together, and suddenly have the children taken away from them and put on different plantations. And the reality that some of those families may never ever see each other again, may never ever be reunited. And that was the reality. I mean, Aziz Hassan writes about it in The Revenge of Kali. And in one of those scenes, and he's really one of the forerunners of indentured literature in South Africa, but he gives an example of that where one of his characters observes these women watching their children being ripped from them and never ever being able to be reunited with them, because some of the British thought it might be nice to have a 3-year-old who could learn to sew buttons onto shirts, in their private homes, separated from their mothers. These are some of the realities of indenture that we have not confronted, Iman. And there's a wider conversation to have about it, about how that affects us as human beings, how that affects us as the colonized, how that affects us as a people who need to revisit the past and the pain of the past and the trauma of the past to de-traumatize ourselves and decolonize ourselves.
I can't agree with you more. And the word indenture is such a diversion, as you say, from the reality of what it really is. We'll come back to that theme about missed aspiration or euthanized aspiration when we learn about Muthan, when we learn about, oh dear, now my memory's failing me, her love interest, Mustafa, yes. And Faisal. And we learn about Devi, and we learn about other people that she encounters in these plantations, what they were hoping to achieve coming to the promised land, and suddenly that doesn't materialize. But let's go back then, before the 400-mile journey kicks off. So Shanti is there, expectant, thinking that this could be her ticket to an entirely different life, concerned all the while that her parents are at home, that her mother's going to have to answer. We'll learn later on just how that story developed when, one of the people with her, somebody she had met earlier on in the story, comes to Port Natal and tells her the fate of her parents. But here they are, and the expectations are high. But very soon, the realization that this was not going to be a trip of a lifetime, or certainly not a trip that would support her dreams, begins to set in on that 400-mile journey towards Madras. things are not going as planned. Some people are trying to run away. The behavior of the overseer, at that, I think it was Ratilal.
That's right.
His behavior in coercing people, in making sure that they can't go back to where they come from, becomes very apparent, and it is a sign of what is to come when they finally reach the processing site, and that is once they reach Madras.
Yeah,
But the question then is,
yes,
she's
yes,
resolute. She accepts that, and she is moving forward.
You know, she has to. She has no choice, because the thought of going back home after having been revealed to have run away because she didn't want to get married would simply be too much to bear. She could be thrown out by her parents for all she knows. So she has to move forward. She has no choice. But the ship, as you say, is it's the first scene of horror and brutality that she actually encounters. And, you know, she's ever optimistic, this teenager who thinks that once I get off the ship, I'm sure it'll be better. It'll be a little bit better than life on the ship. But the ship is the precursor. The ship is the predictor to what is going to happen in the sugarcane plantations. And it really was one of the most difficult parts of the book to write, Iman, because you're grappling there with so many difficult things that are happening, so many traumas that are simultaneously playing out in the lives of people on the ship. I'm not going to talk about the exact incidents which occur. I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but that for me was, it was difficult writing some of those very brutal scenes. I would find myself crying while I wrote, crying and writing through those tears, because we understand dehumanization in South Africa. We understand loss of dignity. We understand denigration. And in a way, we do identify with people, even though they're from the past. And what they went through on the ship's journey is one of the most traumatic aspects of the story, because many of them never even made it to the other side. There was an inherent fear of what was going to happen once they got on those ships. And they were justified in that fear, because it was a terrifying journey in so many ways.
I know that you don't want to give away too much in that section, because it is a seminal section in the book around how the processing worked, around the conditions in the ship itself, around the treatment of the ship's captain, in how he handled people. But there's one story that maybe I thought we could bring up, because there are several in the book that really sort of jar. And I did wonder, Jo, how you felt writing that, because there was such a viscerality and grittiness to the telling of that story that you could picture yourself on that ship, on that rollicking ocean, uncertain, emaciated, not knowing what was going to happen when night came. And for me, one of those poignant stories was about a family whose baby was born on the ship, and that baby was then thrown overboard, and the family was not allowed to even name it.
Yeah, so that is one of the many stories that some of our wonderful historians have recorded, and all credit to Ashwin Desai and Gulan Vaid for having told those stories in such a detailed way that I was able to incorporate them into the book. Those are real stories, Iman. Those are not imagined, and those are not theorized around. Those are just simply things that happened to people on the ship. And of course, you can well imagine, in a society that's governed by ritual, as Indian society is, how important the birth of a baby would have been, how important, if that child passed on, as happened in that context, it would have been to give the child a decent burial. And there they began to suddenly realize that the rituals of home were also starting to fade away. The familiarity of how they said goodbye, how they welcomed children into the world, how they got married, all of those things were slowly starting to die. And that's where we really see how little regard the British had for any observation of those rituals or any respect for them at all.
You know, they say in radio, it's just unbelievable how quickly an hour begins to pass, and we're heading towards that mark. But what I do want to say is, in all of this life that's being lived, lessons that are being learned in really brutal and hard ways, throughout the book, you see this light that is Shanti. And I think it might be appropriate at this point to just read a little bit about why and how she got that name. So it's later in the book, and I'll just read this tiny excerpt. One of her favorite stories was about how you got her name, and this is how Shanti got her name. She said it was not a very common name for a Tamil child. This is according to her mom. After you were born, the priest apparently told them your name was to begin with the letter S. Your father had a long list of names, but your mother went to the temple to pray one day, and she overheard a woman there praying a most wonderful prayer for peace. I think I remember that prayer, Bilal. It's a Vedic chant she used to make me repeat. Lead me from the unreal to the real. Lead me from darkness to light. Lead me from death to immortality. May there be peace everywhere. Shanti, Shanti, Om. And I think a lot of you could probably recite it in the vernacular. But this attribute of hers that I think was embedded in her through that name was something that really would give her succor throughout the course of her life. Because in every telling of tragedy throughout the book, and there are many, there's a brutal scene later on the plantation to which she has been dispatched. There's even more brutality later on when she's accused of murder or when she's charged with murder. But she remains resolute. And this was so remarkable for me throughout the book, that how could someone have kept themselves intact in such a way, in the context of brokenness, deliberate breaking, and have a daughter, have a life, and give her child something of that light that is Shanti.
Iman, how have women done it for centuries? How do modern South African women or African women who live in great poverty, and I get very emotional about this because I think back to 162 years and how our ancestors lived at that time. And it breaks my heart that people in our country still live in those conditions today, particularly women. I can't stand it. And Shanti's story is the story of modern women too. Because there are modern women who have suffered the same trauma, who've lost everything, lost family members, lost children, who are victims of colonization and apartheid, who are living through the largesse that our democratic government has saved for themselves, and who have not been able to do anything but survive. So Shanti, in a manner of speaking, is a symbol of all of those women. She's a symbol of our ancestors. She's a symbol of the women who exist now and the women to come, who will continue to do that amid adversity that is built into us in many ways. And those women continue to give of themselves selflessly. They ensure that their children have the best lives they can possibly provide for them. They ensure that, broken though they are by the systems within which they live, they maintain a semblance of dignity in order to be as whole as they can for the people that they love. And yeah, that is Shanti's story. Shanti's story resonates today and is really no different, in a way, 162 years later almost, to that of many women that we encounter on a daily basis today.
Jo, this emotion that you're evoking right now is something I can tell you, for me, is palpable in your book. You know, sometimes our behavior or our etiquette of reading is, I mean, some of us choose to get enveloped in the stories and we see ourselves in the various characters. And some of us choose to stay a degree removed because it can be quite triggering, you know. But you have such authenticity, and I understand why those emotions are evident on the pages so palpably, because you feel them and because you have felt them. By the way, love came on page 152, I think it was.
You made a note of that, did you?
Yes, I did. And it was in a weird way because, you know, I've lived in Iran and I've witnessed Muharram myself, and I used to be a Shia Muslim. Maybe we'll just say that quietly. But so I've witnessed these ceremonies, and so when it was framed against that backdrop, it It was so weird for me, but it was also so beautiful, and it was across the religious lines. And I'm going to end the formal part of our conversation with the way the book begins and how it ends, with this bit of a promise. And it is in this beautiful poem, Subhasetavali by Vallabh Das. And so this poem is in the letter that Shanti's reading at the very beginning of the book. And it all makes sense as you get to the end of the book, because you're aching for a happy ending. You're just aching for something good out of all of this. And I really thought this was so beautiful. So this was in the letter. And it was said to her during the course of this love affair. Although I conquer all the earth, yet for me there is only one city. In that city, there is for me only one house. And in that house, one room only, and in that room, a bed, and one woman sleeps there, the shining joy and jewel of all my kingdom.
Yeah, what is... Thank you, thanks, Amanda. What is life without love? I think that is ultimately Shanti's takeaway, after a life of joy, tragedy, laughter, an experience that very few people would have had and survived. That is what Shanti takes away. And that
is not brittle.
No.
It pumps.
Yes. And it continues to pump, even when you're an elderly lady, right? There's always a chance at love. And for me, that's really at the center of the book. Love is what drives her, whether it's love for family, love for education, love for friends, the sacrifice that is made for her, it's set in motion by love. But ultimately, that is really what makes it all worth it for Shanti at the end.
So, Jo, just, congratulations again. I've got tons more questions, which I'll ask if there are no questions from the audience, but I really want to allow you. You've come all this way. You came in, okay, well, we're not in the middle of the pandemic, but we're in the pandemic still. But you came because you love Jo, you want to support her writing, and this book is so moving, and it's just worth having, and it's worth sharing with your children. So I'm sure that you have some questions. So anyone who has a question, I want to show off my dress. So I'm quite happy to bring the microphone to you, just by show of hands. Anyone? Or even if it's just say something to this wonderful woman, Clive.
Gosh, Clive, that's a very difficult question. I've grappled with that. I conservatively still call it historical fiction because, that for me it's a very clear-cut category. But it certainly veers over into that because there's a lot of research in it for starters. There are definitely excerpts from historical and academic published books that I dug into for this. So the idea was that it's not common for people to necessarily sit down with a textbook, but how can I actually make that knowledge accessible? Because here you have the academics and the historians who've done all the hard work of mining that information, and then it's shared with so tiny an audience at the end of it, and yet it is worthy. So there is quite a lot of fact embedded in the fiction. And I'm going to let you call it that, if you would like, live faction. I have to tell you that, so our families have been neighbors for a very long time, but very, very close. And sadly, my parents have moved away, but my mom still talks to Malini's mom every day, just about on the phone. But the interesting thing is, when I was shaping the notions of Hinduism, particularly where the generosity of Hinduism comes in, I used your family very much as a benchmark of that.
Wow.
So you're in the book. Thank you, Mom. I think, one of my concerns around the book, Iman, when I started not just writing, but approaching a publisher, was that this was going to be seen as a kind of minority story, right? Indian people form a minority in this country, just over 1 million people. Who cares? Does anyone really care about this history? But the more I wrote and the more I thought about it, and I'm so privileged to have come upon Nkanyezi Chabalala, because she's a woman of vision. She's a woman who sees the bigger picture, but she also sees the linkages between us as women and as people. And she devoured those connections in a way that I didn't expect her to. And she appreciated them on such a deep level. And thank you, Teresa, because you legitimize my having written this book for us all as people with a shared history. We don't think about our history being collective. We think very much in terms of a sectionalized history. This is my history as a person of Indian descent, my history as a person of British descent or white descent or African descent. And really it is a shared history. And we need to start thinking of it more in that way. So thank you so much. And with Yudi, it's amazing. So here's Shanti 162 years ago, fighting many of the same battles we as women are still fighting today. And we've got to do something about those vestiges, right? For heaven's sake, we've got to break out of them, and we've got to be brave, and we've got to strike out in the way that we want. And I know that Indian families are not the only ones which grapple with that. There are women in all sorts of cultures, because of course all the cultures in our country are patriarchal. On our continent, most of them are patriarchal. Very few places in the world which embrace matriarchy as part of their culture. But it's time we broke out, and it's hard. It's hard because you are stigmatized. You are often alienated and ostracized. But we've got to do what we've got to do, girls. And because I'm not sure I actually know the answer to it. Because Shanti she's an appendage, but one that kind of lives on her own and has made her own decisions about how she wants to be depicted on the page. But she learns that lesson very late in her life. And maybe that's something that women in our society continue to do. That for many decades, we go through our lives, we endure some of the most difficult things that society throws at us, that is expected of us culturally, religiously, from a gendered point of view, politically even. And we endure it because we believe we have to. It's often towards the end of our lives that we suddenly have that realization that I should have broken out earlier. I should have done what I wanted. It's funny, I was reading something the other day about the kind of things people say on their deathbeds. And you may have read that because it's been widely shared on social media, but for those who haven't, the most common sentiment that is shared on people's deathbeds is, I wish I had done what I really wanted to do with my life. And really, that for me is where the freedom lies.
Okay. The way I interpret that, if I may, is what happens here is sometimes we fall into a false dichotomy about how women, it's always them surviving and pioneering on. No, some of them end up broken, and they do die broken. Some of them revert to martyrdom, like many of our parents have. Oh, they'll slave along with the horrible husband, and they'll do the work, and they'll do the stuff. But you, my girl, do differently. They have never accepted that there is still a lingering choice for them while they have life. So through these lessons, sometimes we land on a spot of where we can have the full perspective of our lives, and sometimes we don't. But that is just the human story. But we have to learn from others and other stories that there is an alternative. Final one from you, Grant. Yeah.
As a Joe.
Hello, Grant.
Congratulations on your book. I was really, really thrilled to see your writing, and that you have this book coming out. Both as someone who has a book in himself, and hopefully, it's inspiring for that to come out. But also, I am a child of Sugarcane, somebody who grew up on a sugarcane farm in Natal, North Coast, 4th generation. My great-grandmother was on a sugarcane farm there 100 years ago. So I'm looking forward to connecting with that. But my question is around trauma. In the United States, there's a resurgence of the psychological theory called intergenerational trauma, looking at how trauma from slavery is passed down through generations, that the people today in 2021, African Americans, are experiencing that trauma in a very real way. It's manifested differently, but they are trying to understand how that actually plays out today in very real ways, not just theoretical. So I was wondering if that was, as you wrote the book and looking at that journey from 160 plus years ago to today, from where you stand as a descendant, is that something that you thought about? Is that something that you channeled in some way into characters or felt yourself? Or is it something you believe you contain as a descendant today in your life now?
Sure, that's a beautiful question, Grant. And then it's an emotional question because it's true, I do carry that, and I know I do. And in a way, this book has allowed me a little bit of space to just release a bit of that. But every one of us in this room is carrying that. And we're carrying it as people who were colonized, as people who might have been brought here forcibly, as people who were brutalized over the centuries, as people who had to again relive that during apartheid. Even our white brothers